As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of the Malcolm Effect. Joining me, I'm so happy and honored and privileged to be in conversation so soon. Usually, when I have guests, it's like a year or two again before I get to interview them again. But I'm happy to be in conversation with Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Welcome back to the Malcolm Effect. How is it going?
Thanks for having me back on. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And the voice you're familiar with, my co-host and comrade, Christian Joseph. So, Professor, you recently went to China and Vietnam, and given the nature of the propaganda that is directed at actually existing socialism, particularly China in this moment, I guess first and foremost, what took you to China and what took you to Vietnam?
Well, my trip to China was the third that I've taken, and I've had a longstanding interest in understanding the Chinese project, both in terms of its deeper history and then also regarding what it looks like on the ground. And so I was invited to give a presentation there related to Domenico Losurdo's Western Marxism, and then some of my research on cultural class warfare. But given that the trip is so far, I decided to take a little bit more time and explore southern China because I'd been to Beijing, Shanghai, and other parts further up north. But then this time I was around Shanghai, Guangzhou, and in the south. And then I also wanted to go to Vietnam because I've also been theoretically understanding kind of its history and where it segues, but also diverges from the history of China. And so equally, I wanted to kind of see it on the ground and mobilize some context there to get a kind of sense of what the Vietnamese project looks like from the inside.
Thank you so much. So, I guess what were your main observations? What does it look like for countries who are trying to build socialism in, I guess, a global capitalistic system?
Well, at this point, it looks rather impressive. You know, people are probably
Hmm.
familiar with the growth rates in China. It's the largest economy according to purchasing power parity. Recently, it came out that its growth rate last year was around 5%. It's just at the economic level outstrips anything that you see elsewhere in the world. You know, the US's GDP last year was at 2.8%. European Union was at 1.1. Japan was down at 0.3. And so it is an economic powerhouse, as I imagine most people know. But what's integral to socialism is that economic growth is not just taken by a parasitic class and driven upward in order to line the pockets of the billionaire class, but instead that value becomes something that's reinvested in society in various ways, right? This can be through social welfare, it can be through infrastructure projects, education, the reduction of unemployment, healthcare, et cetera. And in the case of both China and Vietnam, I think it's immediately both visible, but then, of course, you know, I never rely just on my subjective or anecdotal experience in order to analyze the situation. I always compare and contrast it to broader analyses of Chinese society and history, and the same with Vietnam. And it's very clear that in the case of China, which I'll just take as an example, I mean, the living standards there have increased dramatically. And extreme poverty, as probably most of your listeners know, has been eliminated in the largest poverty alleviation program in the history of humanity, lifting 850 people out of extreme poverty. And China's become, we've seen this very clearly in the news as of late, a global leader in science and technology, right? With the recent developments in AI, with all of what they're doing around electric vehicles and with renewable energies. It's really leading the way in many ways in addressing the climate crisis, particularly when you compare it, of course, to the incoming Trump administration that is, I guess, convinced that science doesn't exist and that climate change doesn't exist. So they are putting the pedal literally to the metal. Chinese society is also very stable. You don't see the broad forms of social pathology that characterize U.S. American society, and you also don't see major kind of social conflicts that you get in a country like the United States that is so rank in its various forms of institutionalized racism and its class warfare, as we see being kind of very much unleashed in this moment, particularly with the assault on the immigrant population and meaning the most oppressed and exploited of the workers, and on any form of protest across the board. And it's also very important that, the Chinese government enjoys a really outstanding level of popularity and legitimacy. This isn't covered enough in the West, of course, but here we have regularly presidents who are in office who have very, very low support ratings, and we have a very high level of abstention in every single election. People are disconnected from politics in general because they recognize that the political class is not serving their interests. That's not the case at all in China. And so it is very interesting to see how that works on the ground, but then also the ways in which that manifests many of the fundamental socialist principles. Because at the end of the day, there are many different definitions of socialism, but if we think of socialism both in terms of its socioeconomic base and in terms of its kind of political and legal superstructure, so the kind of institutions that run society, at the level of the socioeconomic base, they're developing incredible value and they're redistributing it through society. And you see that very visibly in the infrastructure projects, the health of society, the cleanliness, etc. But then you also have in the political legal superstructure people who feel both empowered in their forms of governance and who participate in it in various ways. China has the largest legislative body in the world, and many, if not the majority, I'd have to check the exact statistics, but I presume it actually is the majority, are normal working class people. These are teachers and nurses and construction workers, etc. Whereas, of course, in the United States, everyone in the national government is a millionaire. And so you have a clear case, bourgeois, meaning capitalist so-called democracy or pseudo-democracy here in the United States, whereas you have what they refer to as a people-centered democracy in China. So there's much more that could be said about this, but these are at least some of my general impressions regarding why China, I think, ultimately needs to be understood in terms of what its people say that it is. It's very chauvinistic, I find, for people in the West to say, well, China isn't socialist when they haven't been there, they haven't studied it, they usually don't know the language, and they don't actually listen to what the Chinese people say they are doing. They say that they are developing socialism with Chinese characteristics, not socialism in terms of some cookbook that somebody has, but in terms of the specific material circumstances within which they find themselves. And so instead of falling back on social chauvinism, I think we should take the Chinese at their word. And I think it also is clearly demonstrated that their word is not disconnected from reality due to many of the reasons that I just cited.
Thank you. Incredible. The image you've just painted of China is far from so much of discussion, even amongst the broad umbrella of what we call the left. And I think, lifting 850 million people out of extreme poverty is no small feat. I will pass on to Christian.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to focus in on kind of, the latter end, what you were speaking about, Gabriel, in terms of the many critiques of China from the Western left. And I saw that you spoke to some of just the pure ignorance as not being familiar with China, not having enough direct experience. But do you think there's also something ideologically that has almost infected the Western left that causes them to have these kind of positions towards China or even other socialist projects that we see around the globe?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the work that I've been doing recently, like the introduction to Western Marxism by Losurdo that I co-authored with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, and a lot of my other research is on the ideological limitations of the Western left, which ultimately are driven by the economic base, meaning that it is the hyper development of the imperial core and the production of a kind of labor aristocracy in the core, meaning that workers, at least those who are salaried and have stable jobs, are situated at the very top global labor pyramids. And the professional managerial class stratum is definitely at the very top when you look globally, at least for the most part. Of course, there are always exceptions and contradictions and things like this. And given the material benefits that have been reaped by those classes within the imperial core, there's a very strong tendency towards social chauvinism, meaning a tendency to think that one's society or one's group within that society is naturally superior to those around the world and to look down on them with disdain. And much of what is called Western Marxism has manifested precisely that. There's also a real fundamental lack of materialist rigor and, for that matter, conceptual nuance within much of the Western left, and more specifically, certain forms of Western Marxism. If you're serious about studying actually existing socialism, then you have to roll up your sleeves and you have to dig in. You can't simply read the propaganda that is produced within the Western world and leave it at that. And so there's one point that I think is really important and that we really need to learn from, and that I've been studying and really focused on as of late. And that is that in the period of socialist transition, because ultimately we're still in very early phase of socialism, capitalism's been around for some 5 centuries and socialism for about 1, and it's only been able to eke out an existence against imperialist forces in fits and starts with some major setbacks. But one of the incredible innovations that you get in China in the 1970s, you see not the exact same thing, but it follows a very similar pattern with the Doi Moi or the renewal in Vietnam in the 1980s, is that you have socialists who are being self-critical about the nature of the socialist project to date and recognizing that they need to change it. Meaning that what you have on the ground is very strong materialist analysis. And perhaps one of the most fundamental aspects of this that trips up, I think, a lot of the Western left is the recognition that if you're going to develop the early phases of socialism, right? We're not talking about the late phases of socialism or some communist utopia or something like that. It's the very early phases of socialism. Then you are going to need to do that in an imperialist world. You have to develop the productive forces. You've been given a hind start by centuries of imperialism. And in that regard, one of the things that both China and Vietnam have done, and there are other examples, Nicaragua would be a really interesting example to compare as well, is they have engaged more directly with the broader capitalist world, drawing on ultimately principles that one can trace out and that go back to someone like Lenin. Lenin actually said that some capitalism is inevitable in the early phases of socialism. And he claimed that we must utilize capitalism as the intermediary link between small production and socialism, as the means or a path and a method of increasing the productive forces. This is exactly what you see in the renewal in Vietnam and the reform and opening up in China, but it's based on a really profound self-critique, a self-critique that recognizes that there were simplistic ideas that had held previously having to do with a kind of homogenization of the end goal of socialism and wanting to leap quickly to a kind of new phase that wasn't recognizing the extent to which you first have to develop the productive forces. And during that transition period, it's extremely important to develop them while continuing to control the state and while not letting the kind of towering heights of the economy and the banking sector out of one's control. And capitalism really does have incredible abilities to both innovate and develop. And so I see what both the Chinese and Vietnam doing in this kind of reform period of the 70s and 80s is a kind of dialectical critique of the ways in which socialism should relate to capitalism. It's not that socialism magically leaps into a new world and severs all ties to the extant capitalist world. It's that it orchestrates a kind of dialectical critique in which it attempts to take the best elements of capitalism, which drive the development of the productive forces, which lead to various forms of innovation, which also through various forms of competition tend to intensify those forms of innovation and those forms of productivity, while at the same time than using state mechanisms in order to control the ill effects of capitalism, the development of the parasitic class, the tendency towards monopolization, the drive ultimately away from innovation, which we see very clearly in the case of China's recent developments around AI. And so all of that, I think, needs to be situated in terms of what we have in the kind of reform periods in both China and Vietnam is a self-critique of certain elements within the socialist tradition in the name of a more rigorously dialectical materialist assessment of both theoretically and practically what it means to develop socialism in its first stages as a transition out of capitalism. So I'll sum that up by saying I think we still have a lot to learn from these projects, and that the Western left, unfortunately, does not really situate us in such a way that we can do that, because they tend to fall back on rather idealist positions or uninformed calumny instead of doing the rigorous research that is necessary in order to understand how these projects actually work.
Thank you for that. And I think even in your previous answer, there was one moment in which you don't be before the one you just gave. I think there was a moment where you talked about folks wanting to carry out socialism almost like it comes straight out of a cookbook. And I see you're evoking the term dialectical materialism. And I just wanted, because I think one of the great things about the Malcolm effect is that it's an opportunity to really introduce people to terms and explain them. But could you speak a little bit to what dialectical materialism is, and how dialectics oppose mechanical thinking, and how materialism opposes idealistic thinking?
Yeah, I can. It's a broad question, so we could probably spend a few hours on it, but I'll try to be succinct. Materialism, Marx and Engels, and then of course others in this tradition developed it, is a position that rejects idealism being the assumption ultimately that it's ideas or discourse or metaphysical otherworldly forces that ultimately drive history. But materialism also rejects brute empiricism, meaning the assumption that there are just given empirical facts and that the role of theoretical work is to analyze those facts and to adhere as closely as possible to them. Materialism occupies in many ways a very different position because it provides us with a dialectical critique of the very opposition between idealism and empiricism. Idealism ultimately assumes that there's a realm of the mind or spirit that governs the world. Empiricism basically says the opposite. No, there's an extant, concrete world that is primary, and any ideas or spirits are secondary to that if they exist at all. What materialism does is it dialectically resolves this, or I should say works through this opposition between empiricism and idealism, or between the world and mind, by saying that ultimately what there is a form of human consciousness that is embedded within a broader material world that conditions how it thinks and therefore how human beings act, but that also is framed by it and then understood by it, right? So materialism is ultimately it manifests a dialectical understanding of how human thought and human beings are situated in a broader empirical world that conditions their existence, but that they in turn have some agency over. And it's really that processual relationship, if you will, that is foregrounded in materialism, rather than this kind of reified philosophic opposition between mind and world, between subject and object, between spirit and matter, etc. And so what we have in materialism then is already a manifestation of dialectics. And there's a lot that could be said about dialectics, but I think that for me at least, some of the most coherent elucidations of dialectics have to do with an understanding of the world in which it's recognized that everything is in process. There's nothing outside of the flow of time. There's no consciousness, some godly spirit, some beginning point to existence. Everything is in the flow of time. But then secondly, everything is interconnected. You don't have isolated phenomenon. You have an interconnected world that is developing, and that interconnected world, this is the third point, is linked together in a totality. In that regard, dialectics is a way of among other things, because there's much more that could be said about this, but just trying to stick to this point, dialectics is a way of apprehending material reality by recognizing that it is fundamentally driven by processes that are interlinked in an overall totality. And so for a dialectical analysis, you're always looking at the social totality and the relations between kind of nodal points within that totality. Now, all of this is a little bit of a deep philosophic interlude, if you will, but it ultimately reveals the kind of methodological background to some of what I was just saying about China and Vietnam. And so if I could just for a second, I would say that what you see in the case of the reform, the renewal and the reform and opening up in these two cases is a dialectical assessment of the attempts to develop socialism in an imperialist world, recognizing that socialism isn't some purified thing or entity that is distinct from the broader world, but it is a process of social transformation that inevitably is linked to the dominant socioeconomic system of capitalism and the way in which it has structured the world. Therefore, what I see operative in the Vietnamese and Chinese case is a really robust dialectical understanding and materialist analysis of what it means to develop socialism in a capitalist world, and more specifically, socialism in a world in which you have the grand phase of neoliberal revanchism and ultimately the destruction of the Soviet Union and Soviet-style socialism. And all of that, also, the last thing that I'll say is that ultimately the truth has to do not simply with being theoretically correct, but being practically capable of changing the world. And so dialectical materialism proves its superiority over other forms of analysis by its ability to practically transform the world. And what we see going on in countries like this is a level of people-centered development that you don't see elsewhere in the world, meaning you do see very clear practical successes, which is not, of course, to say that there aren't contradictions, that there aren't other setbacks, there aren't criticisms that one might have, but you have to recognize the incredible ability to develop in such a way that the value produced by the workers is shared with them in a way that improves their overall lives.
Thank you. I know it's no easy feat responding to how do we define dialectical materialism and its applicability today. So I deeply appreciate that response. I think on the question of critique, there is definitely a revolutionary critique of a process that you feel a part of, and a reactionary critique, right, which is often for those coming from the corners of the academy in the West. I guess a question I do have, and I know you've hinted at it and kind of spoken to it, but if we're sitting down in front of several Western leftists, or we're sitting in front of those who call themselves Maoists in the West and try to write off China as just saying it, after the reform era, it became capitalist. How do we begin to respond to
Well, the first response is that that's not true. What happened
that?
under the Deng Xiaoping era was a slow and gradual, we can say now since we've discussed it, a dialectical introduction of experiments with allowing capitalism in certain regions, particularly those regions that actually I just visited in China, which are the regions surrounding the four major cities kind of surrounding Hong Kong in southern China. And that process was very gradual, and it was based on the primacy of practice, meaning that there were studies that were done to see what worked, what didn't work, and then changes were made accordingly. Through that process, it became practically clear that, and this took a number of years, of course, because what socialist projects are doing, I should just note as a kind of parenthetical, is they're charting uncharted territory. They're doing things that people have never done before. And so the practical aspect is really important, and trial and error is essential. And so errors do happen, and the way in which socialism has historically always dealt with them is through self-critique. It's the lifeblood of an actually existing socialist project, is to be able to engage in self-critique in order to move on to new forms of experimentation. But what was really recognized in the Chinese case through this long and gradual process is that it was working in very specific ways to develop the productive forces. Now, there were contradictions that emerged. Deng Xiaoping speaks very clearly about this. Some people will get richer before others. So there was an increase in economic inequality that was recognized. Now, was that embraced as something that was great? No, it was recognized as a tactical compromise in order to advance a long-term project. The same is true for the environmental footprint, for instance, which China, we now know, it's very clear what their strategic horizons are. They are working through the contradictions that were developed by their ecological footprint. They're not done with that by any stretch of the imagination, but they are global leaders in renewable energy and a whole series of other things. And so what you have in China is, through this gradual process, the eventual introduction of capitalist elements within a socialist country where the state itself is not in control of the capitalist class. The state is in control of, or is controlled by, the people manifest in the party that is leading the people and led them out of the century of humiliation when they finally made their successful revolution in 1949. And the towering heights of the economy are state-owned, meaning that, including the banking sector, or major sectors, the banking industry. So in that regard, to say that China is capitalist is the epitome of a non-dialectical, reified, and what we could call, following Engels, metaphysical description of China. Metaphysics, Engels meant by metaphysics, an approach to the world that just assumes that there are rigid, kind of reified entities. So one would say, well, China is either absolutely socialist or it's absolutely capitalist, and not leave any space for a fine-grained dialectical analysis that demonstrates that China has a socialist-oriented project that oversees the state, the towering heights of the economy, and has a clear project of social welfare, while allowing capitalism to operate within the country. And it has done that precisely in order to further develop its productive forces and to become a kind of productive powerhouse. And so the other thing that's important is that, and this would take a little bit longer to unpack, but there's a way in which China, I think, has played the long game. And we see this playing itself out very clearly at this point in time. China did allow itself to become the production center of global capitalism, right? And many Marxists, particularly Western Marxists in the kind of 80s and 90s, were rejoicing in this idea that, well, China's just gone full-on capitalist, because they did open up and allow their enormous labor pools to be used by Western corporations for their cheap labor, and also to offload their environmental footprint. And in that regard, what China has been able to do, and this is a level of strategic thinking that you really don't see much of in Western Marxism, is that the plan wasn't just that China would forever remain the kind of colonial labor slaves of multinational corporations situated in the West. That was never the project. The project was a need to develop the productive forces and a very clear recognition, and Deng Xiaoping put this at the center of his entire project, for technology transfer. Because Deng went and he visited the factories. He went to Japan. He went and saw all of the kind of Asian tiger economies, and he understood full well that it didn't matter how hard the Chinese worked. If they did not have modern forms of technology, they would never be able to develop above and beyond what the capitalist countries had done. They needed technology transfer. And so one of the conditions for a lot of the capitalist investment that has occurred in China is technology transfer. And so in playing the long game, what they did is they opened up, they allowed the Western economies basically to shift their productive economies to the East. They became highly financialized, which of course we see in the case of the United States, stripped out their productive base except for the military industry and Hollywood and the propaganda industries, which I don't know if you'd really want to call those productive. Counterproductive perhaps would be a more appropriate term. But in doing so, then now they have a very robust, productive economy, and they've moved up the value chain in the way in which they're producing. And they've gotten an enormous amount of technology transfer that has allowed them to develop their productive forces, but then also to develop their science and technology in ways that now outstrip the West. And so what we need is not the Western left reified simplistic version of China as in, oh, it's all just socialist or it's all just capitalist. No, do the hard work of looking at how it really operates and how it's been on a process of going through a reform and opening up in order to be able to develop itself in such a way that it can outstrip the capitalist powers that have subjugated it for a very, very long time. And I think it's very clear with the rise of China, that's what we see in the current world. We have capitalism in crisis in the imperial core that has stripped out its productive economy, financialized everything, is incapable of even like mildly unchaotic forms of governance. And in China, you have a rising powerhouse that has a very robust productive economy and that now is evening out its unequal economic distribution and becoming much more, this is a gradual and ongoing process, but one of the goals is to become more egalitarian and to develop much more of a robust middle class.
Thank you. And you kind of indicate so many threads in what you've just said, particularly when I think about technology transfer. I often think about that in relationship to development in Africa today. And I think I sincerely believe China serves as such a great model for development because we know, I guess we can talk about transforming a peasant society into a proletariat. I mean, what Africa suffers from is absolutely technology transfer, the inability to exploit our own resources for the benefit of the people. And I think China definitely serves a model for us. And I think just to kind of write off China I think anyone who writes off China so simply doesn't have any investment in actually building socialism today, in my understanding. And I guess just to kind of follow up again, I'm asking these questions somewhat polemically because I just know these are the common conversations that are taking place in leftist circles. So I guess on your trip, what were some of the internal conversations you heard about people who are thinking about their own process within China? And alongside that, people then say, oh, but China's just authoritarian and repressive as well. So what were people saying within China about their own process that you heard or privy to?
Well, I should perhaps qualify it that I don't speak Chinese. And so a lot of my interactions were with intellectuals who spoke
Mm-hmm.
English and, journalists, activists, and things like this. And so I only had access, to a particular
Okay.
segment of the population. But fortunately, a lot of the intellectuals that I met with, some of whom have been teaching in China for a very long time, are China experts. And so I felt like I was in good hands in relationship to their kind of overall analysis. The term authoritarianism, I think, has created a lot of confusion within the Western left because if you're a socialist country and you want to continue on the socialist path, then you need to maintain sovereignty. And as William Bloom and Michael Parenti and others have analyzed in quite some detail, there's not a single socialist experiment that hasn't been subjected to the most heinous forms of imperialist destabilization. Destabilization's the kind term that's used in internal documents. What this means is an attempt to destroy the sovereignty of socialist nations. In other words, you need, and this isn't a choice on the part of socialists, it's a requirement on the part of those who want to develop an alternative world within a violent and aggressive imperialist world. You need a strong state in order to do that. If you look at material history, it's very clear that if you don't, they will crush you. And that's what they've done repeatedly. And so, is there a strong state in places like China and Vietnam? Yeah, there is a strong state. Are there elements to that are misunderstood within the Western left? Yes, absolutely. I mean, most people don't understand that within China, there is what's called a systematic full chain democracy, and it includes 5 major democratic processes. There's your democratic elections, consultation, decision making, democratic management, democratic supervision. I mean, there is a consultatory aspect to their democratic project that is very unlike, meaning a great deal of direct participation, what you see in the West, where we have the greatest democracy that money can buy. And as you probably know from study that was done at Princeton, a multivariate analysis at Princeton a number of years ago, it was demonstrated, and there are other studies that show as much, that average US citizens have little to no impact on public policy, whereas major corporations, through their lobbies, have an enormous impact on public policy. And so instead of just crying authoritarianism as soon as a country maintains its sovereignty, I think that what should be done on the Western left is to think critically about what it means to actually build an alternative system in a hostile world, and then to analyze how these systems actually work, right? And this is, I should perhaps qualify that, there are, of course, in the history of actually existing socialism, there have been times when that the state has overstepped in various ways, where it has overreacted. There's been paranoia that's been developed within certain states because of all of the destabilization campaigns, infiltration campaigns, etc. That's one of the goals, is to make these states internally unstable. In fact, one of the things that, this is on a different topic, but one of the campaigns that the Central Intelligence Agency ran against the Warsaw Pact countries was to spread the lie that there was a anti-communist conspiracy within the top levels of government, so that they spread paranoia among the Warsaw Pact countries, and they did it very intentionally, very directly, and unfortunately very successfully, so that those states reacted by cracking down on people, officials who had been accused acting out or conspiring against the state, when, at least as far as we know, according to the extant record, many of them actually did not. They had been framed. They'd been framed by Western intelligence agencies. And so all of that broader context really needs to be brought into these analyses. And we should maybe bracket or shelve all of our moralism and all our judgmental kind of approach to these projects, and again, roll up our sleeves and do some of the hard work of analyzing and looking at what these projects actually look like, and the odds that are against them, and all of the forces that are arrayed against them.
I guess to follow up and kind of follow the line, because I think what I appreciate, Gabriel, is that what you're doing is being able to handle a lot of the critiques of China on the left within the West. And another thing that I hear is folks often talk about different, almost like esoteric situations in which China has negative relations, or is not doing enough for such and such country in the global south. And I don't want to get into all those, particulars at the moment, but I guess what I wanted you to speak to is, how is this developmental model that China has built, and how is China's approach to socialism and overall position within the global world system important for developing anti-imperialism?
It's a really important question, and I agree that there are many criticisms of China regarding the positions it's taken on West Asia, for instance, or its lack of more aggressive confrontation with the imperialist powers around struggles for decolonization around the world. And I do think that all of these criticisms need to really reflect upon the deeper history of socialist experiments in China more specifically, and what it represents in the world today. China has obviously made, significant shifts in its foreign policy and in its developmental projects, and it is no longer involved in the same way as it was at times in the past with, for instance, the support for armed resistance struggles and things like this. One of the things that I think is integral to China's model, and where it differs from other models that have existed in the past, is that it really sees social and economic development as central. And so it has, through BRICS, through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the Shanghai Cooperation, a whole series of global organizations, set about to try to set up global infrastructure that supports the socio-economic development of the global South. And in doing that, it has made the decision, and people could be critical of this. I also think it's really refreshing for people to recognize, Momodou highlighted this a minute ago, you can have criticism. You can say, oh, this should be done or that should be done. But there's a big difference between criticisms that recognize the integrity of the project and support it versus criticisms of these projects that are just reactionary. But be that as it may, if one is critical or not I think what is clear is that China has put forth a project of socioeconomic development in which the fundamental goal is to provide global infrastructure for the development of the global south. And that is precisely what they're doing. And there have been tactical compromises and sacrifices that they've had to make along the way, right? Many people say, oh, well, China's working with all of these countries that are reactionary and allow them to be trading partners, allow them into the Belt and Road Initiative and other such things. China is looking for a peaceable form of development that provides this overall infrastructure and then also demonstrates to people a model, not that they want, I don't think, everyone else to just accept or adapt, because every country is living in different circumstances, but a model of development that is the mere opposite of what you have in the imperialist world, the kind of IMF, World Bank, debt trap model that everyone, I think, is familiar with through the decades aggressive neoliberalism. And one of the moments for me that was very revealing in this regard was, and this echoes as well, one of the things that Momodou just said a moment ago, is that I I was part of a meeting with a number of people from the global south who were political leaders and intellectuals and journalists, and they're involved in the struggle for anti-imperialist liberation and for the development of their countries, many Africans, many Latin Americans. And one of the things that they almost all said, and it was like in unison, is that what China represents in the global infrastructure that it's developing for countries in the global south is the most important alternative in the world today. Because it means that all of these countries can, instead of just signing up for various forms of financial and economic imperialism, which is what the World Bank and IMF has on offer, they can instead work with a form of, what China refers to as win-win development, so that they can develop themselves socially and economically. Well, also, of course, it's not a charity project. China has built enormous projects. There's a number of them in Africa, right? Universities and other infrastructural projects that are more or less charity projects. But these are very few and far between, because the goal, because they've done like debt cancellation and things like this. But the goal is really to then allow societies to develop on their own and not become client states that are underdeveloped, where the value is just driven towards China. And so one of the things that they've done in a number of African countries is that then they also don't only run these kind of development projects, but they also have set up schools and training sites so that they can educate the local population so that they can move up the value chain, meaning that they can be trained as engineers who can then oversee, and technicians who can oversee a lot of these development projects. And that's very different than just kind of coming into a country and using it in imperialistic terms in order to take advantage of its cheap labor and keep it as underdeveloped as possible. So I think all of that gives a kind of different image what China is. And for those in the imperial West, they should really pay attention to what political leaders and organizers in the global South are saying. Like, how are they reacting to and engaging with these projects? Because those are the people who are practically on the ground and who have an immediate experience of what's going on. And this isn't to say that there aren't, again, valid criticisms and in certain points, things that might need to be adjusted. And China has adjusted them. In certain cases, they've really cracked down on particular corporations that were operating in Africa, for instance. But overall, the alternative infrastructure that they're putting forth and the alternative architecture really is making an enormous difference. And that's the reason they're in the crosshairs of the US empire.
I guess like to kind of round it out, and you started to touch on it at the end. What do you think those in the Western left need to do with regards to China? And is it a question of, dealing with this propaganda machine? Is it a question of almost making trips similar to yours? The certain making certain diplomatic trips? What kind of connections or what kind of things should folks in the Western left be doing to undo all of these reactionary tendencies and imperialistic tendencies that we often see?
There's much that can be done. I mean, one element is that we really need to cultivate critical media literacy skills. It shocks me the extent to which so many people on the Western left basically read propaganda, both academic and journalistic propaganda, as if it was the truth. And then they rely on that. And so a lot of my own work, in fact, a book that I'm currently finishing called Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, the first half of it is really on the architecture of propaganda that's been set up in the imperial world. And that propaganda is not at all simply journalistic. It is academic through and through. And the academic laundering state propaganda is an enormously big business. I mean, Sovietology is basically the way in which it's existed in the United States, and a lot of it in Western Europe as well, historically has been an intelligence project. And so people on the Western left should know how to analyze and understand propaganda so that they can then get access to the best possible resources. And I'd be happy, if you have show notes or something like that, to share a number of works that I think are solid works on China,
Yes,
on
please.
Vietnam. Carlos Martinez has a great book on it. In fact, Carlos Martinez and Keith Bennett recently edited a book that I wrote a review of called People's China at 75 that I highly recommend. Roland Bohr's work. There's much work that is very, very solid on actually existing socialism in China. And I think the two other things that are important are that listening to and studying the Marxism of the Global South is incredibly important. Getting over social chauvinism and recognizing that it's not necessarily people like Adorno or Horkheimer or Foucault who actually understood, even at a basic level, the world that they were living in and were contributing to a positive struggle for transforming it in a more egalitarian, ecologically sustainable manner. It's people like Walter Rodney. It's, people like Cheng and Fu, who really have an analysis that positions us at the point of view of the victims of imperialism and frames the world in those terms. And the other thing that I would say is that, of course, if people have the opportunity to go and visit these countries, it's incredibly educational. And if they can't visit due to financial means, then get plugged into the media production from those countries, reach out to people in those countries or try to find contacts. We need a lot more breaking down of the information blockade so that we can have person-to-person exchanges, so that we can have a real sense of what these countries look like on the inside. The recent explosion of Red Note and the people migrating from TikTok to Red Note was fascinating in this regard. So even at the level of social media, right, you can get plugged into various forms of social media or digital platforms like WeChat that are not controlled by big tech and are not just a kind of cesspool of, ignorance and aggressivity that are getting increasingly worse and will get increasingly worse due to the fascists who own and control them. And so those are just some ideas. There are others that I'd be happy to share, but it's at least a starting point. I guess in a nutshell, I would say that we really have to educate ourselves and get over the kind of arrogant social chauvinism that a lot of people in the Western left are imbued with due to their class standing, but then also due to the way in which they're intellectually trained. If someone is at an Ivy League university and they are reading what's on the Ivy League syllabi, then there is a tendency, and of course there's some good work that is done in those institutions, but there's a tendency to assume that, well, if it's published by Yale University Press or Harvard University Press, this must be the definitive account of X or Y phenomenon, when in fact it's usually the opposite that is the case, meaning that these are very tightly controlled networks of knowledge production, distribution, and consumption. And so people need to tap into alternative frameworks of knowledge production, distribution, and consumption so that they can break out of the kind of imperial ideological bubble.
Thank you so much. I'll wait for those show notes and I'll add them to the description. As always, folks, I highly, highly recommend you people tapping into Professor Gabriel Rockhill's work. His work for me has become somewhat of a North Star actually in thinking about the ways we engage these questions of our positionality within the imperial core who believe in a socialist horizon. So until next time, everyone, take care.